In my communications with other YouTubers, I'm sometimes asked who my creative heroes are. And I do have a bunch of them, of course. We all do. And there are people whose lives and achievements get me fired up just by thinking about them. People who will always be my creative role models and sources of inspiration. And if I had to put together a top 10 list of them, in no particular order, mind you, it would look something like this. So Marcel Delgado was the guy who built the monsters of Skull Island for the original 1933 King Kong. Over armatures machined by studio technicians, he built up muscle, tissue, and skin using sponge rubber, cotton, and dental dam, which is a latex material, creating some of the most famous stop-motion monsters ever. He also created the puppets for Son of Kong and Mighty Joe Young. But his most impressive feat was probably building the hordes of dinosaurs for the 1925 The Lost World, where he was often called on to stay very long nights at the studio when the animation work of the day was finished, stripping off the rubber skin and muscles on some puppets to repair worn joints, and then build up all that tissue again, making the puppets look like brand new. With his brother Victor, Delgado also built the giant Kong hand that holds Fay Ray aloft, as well as working on the giant Kong bust you can see here and there in the movie. He worked in the prop workshop at RKO for many years and then started Project Unlimited, a proto-industrial light and magic, you could say, with Gene Warren and Tim Barr, where they and a bunch of other fantastic talents worked on a score of movies and TV shows. Delgado came from very humble beginnings, and he was more or less discovered by Kong animator Willis OBrien when he created the effects for The Lost World. As it turned out, Delgado was a natural creative powerhouse, and I'll always be full of admiration for his imagination and incredible skill as a craftsman. You could say that Willis OBrien was King Kong's dad. He more or less designed the movie King Kong and animated most of the monster scenes in that pivotal film. Before that, he worked on a number of stop-motion short films and was in charge of the animation and effects for the 1925 Lost World. Past Son of Kong and Mighty Joe Young, for which he was awarded an Oscar, OBrien was sort of forgotten by Hollywood. He did all sorts of effects work, but his many ideas and visions for new incredible monster movies were never heeded, which is a great tragedy, I think. Willis OBrien is not the best stop-motion animator ever, but he is one of the most dynamic. When it comes to dramatic animation, both subtle and action-packed, OBrien is hard to beat. King Kong is my favorite movie of all time, and the tandem work of animator Willis OBrien and puppet maker Marcel Delgado is the reason why I'm doing what I'm doing with my life. When it comes to makers of truly magical movies, I think Ray Harryhausen stands head and shoulders above the rest. He was a protege of Willis OBrien, but had much greater luck in realizing his personal projects, especially when he teamed up with movie producer Charles Schneer. While OBrien seemed to prefer prehistoric creatures and themes, you could say that Harryhausen liberated stop-motion effects by making movies based on fairy tales, myths, and legends from many cultures. He really showed that you can tell any kind of exciting story. No subject is impossible if you have the right vision and enough skills. And that's the creative credo I try to live by. Willis OBrien showed me that movies can be fantastical and magical, and Ray Harryhausen showed me that movies could be the tool to tell any kind of story. Ming Chang was one of the creative geniuses behind Project Unlimited in the 1960s. Project Unlimited was a special effects house that was an important precursor to ILM and other similar companies that have now become a staple of the American film industry. But before that, he worked for Disney, creating puppets that would aid the animators on projects like Pinocchio and Bambi. Chang was an amazing sculptor and prop maker, often having to work fast and use fairly simple materials like wood or liquid latex, but still producing fantastic results. Besides creating props and stop-motion puppets for movies like The Time Machine, Tom Thumb, and The Wonderful World of the Brothers Grimm, Chang's most notable work is probably all the stuff he built for the TV shows The Outer Limits and Star Trek. Chang is the guy who made the tricorder, the communicator, the phaser, the Romulan warship, the Klingon bird of prey, and many other props and models. He also made the Gorn outfit, the Tribbles, the Salt Vampire, and a score of other now famous creatures. A couple of years ago I made a Gorn mask replica for Bobby Clark, the actor who played the Gorn in the Arena Star Trek episode. And you might think that the design of the Gorn is simple enough, but when I started sculpting the head I soon found out that the dimensions were very carefully balanced and not so easy to replicate, which made me admire Chang's eye for detail and shapes even more. When I was a kid, I watched a science show for children where the Age of Dinosaurs was illustrated by a clip from, as I later found out, the 1970 movie When Dinosaurs Ruled the Earth. It showed a giant quadruped reptile walking into a canyon with an elk in its mouth. A very cool visual, but what really impressed me was that the animation of the monster was so smooth and lifelike. That animation was performed by Jim Danforth, who also built the creature. Eventually I tracked down more movies that he had worked on, and his incredible special effects work, whether it be animation or matte paintings, never disappointed. To my great joy, I found an interview with Danforth in issue 29 of the magazine Cinemagic. The article was written by another great effects talent, John Dodds, who talked to Danforth about his animation technique, but also about how he built his puppets. All of that turned out to be life-changing information for me, and I still build all of my puppets the Danforth way. Danforth also had tons of ideas for movie projects, including adaptations of A Princess of Mars and other monster-filled adventure yarns. Unfortunately, he seemed to be unable to sell his ideas to movie producers. He never found his patron as Harryhausen did in Charles Schneer. Had Danforth been allowed to create his own series of fantastical movies, like Harryhausen did, I think actually he might have been able to change the movie landscape and change it for the better. I'm sure most of you know about Swedish director Ingmar Bergman, even if you haven't seen any of his movies. It's very plain that Bergman was a massive asshole to many people in his life, especially his own family. But he loved movies above anything else, and though most of his output is very cerebral and dialogue-driven, many of them are also visually stunning, I think, and I love to simply look at them. What I admire about Bergman is his creative output and work aesthetic. In just 1 year he could direct 4 plays, shoot 2 movies, and write a couple of plays of his own and an opera libretto. I really admire people with that kind of relentless output. I find his sheer passion inspiring. It's creativity without any doubt or regrets. Above my illustration and artist heroes, I have to put Hans Arnold above all else. He was born in Switzerland but moved to Sweden in 1947, and it was here that he built a strong career as an illustrator, creating art for magazines, movie posters, and tons of books. Hans Arnold became famous for his surreal horror art, as well as his bustling fairy tale images. He managed to infuse both genres with an effortless sensuality that appealed to both young and adult. He could do both sexiness and innocence, often in the same illustration. As one teen remarked in the 1970s, he could do both horrible monsters and sexy girls, and sometimes they were one and the same. I had the fortune of meeting Hans Arnold when I was 10 years old, and he was both generous with his time and very encouraging about my own art. I'm still inspired by his visions when I make my films. I try to capture that beautiful grotesqueness. So do Google Hans Arnold. I think you'll be astounded and delighted by his immense output and imagination. George Kershaw was an amateur or independent filmmaker with a very curious aesthetic. He was of a kind of anything-goes school of filmmaking, with very bizarre ideas, but with an engaging, energetic style. He did a bunch of films, or pictures, as he called them, with his twin brother Mike, but then sort of branched out on his own. George Kershaw showed that you don't have to have a big budget, or any budget actually, to make a film. Just enthusiasm and good ideas. I think most of George Kershaw's films were made on sheer will, more than anything else, and that's what I love about him and his work. I wish I was as fearless as George Kershaw in my filmmaking, and I wish that making movies as a medium would be less of a mystery to me, because it obviously wasn't to George. Guillermo del Toro seems to be a Hollywood hotshot on and off, simply because he doesn't like to look at trends or follow the lead of anyone else but himself. He loves horror, and he loves monsters, and he's very vocal about that. I love him for being that champion of the grotesque, his ability to make characters out of monsters that would only be stereotypes in someone else's hands. And I also admire him for sticking to his visions and walking away from projects when they start to drift out of his hands. Trends seem to be taking over the filmmaking business, but I think and I hope that Guillermo del Toro will continue to be that shining light of creativity and original and cool ideas. In this ever more and more digital world of movie production, I think Weta Workshop under the management of Richard Taylor stands out like a beacon of hope. There is a Weta Digital, but let's talk about the original workshop, which is still churning out amazing props, weapons, costumes, sets, models, and designs. I've followed the work of Taylor and his team since the very early days, and they have not only been inventive and productive, but also trend-setting, I'd like to say. Every now and then I see movie monsters that are clearly influenced by the work of Weta designers and sculptors, like their Cave Troll and Balrog. Would I love to work at a place like Weta Workshop? Yes, absolutely, of course I would. But I'm not. At least not at this moment. But what I can do is take inspiration from their productivity and their creativity and their incredible imagination, and let that fuel my own imagination to push me into new areas of my own humble filmmaking, so that I will continue to come up with newer things and better things and more interesting things, both for myself and for the people who watch my videos. Needless to say, there are many other artists who have inspired me over the years and who keep inspiring me, but if you ask me for a top 10 list, then the people I've talked about in this video will have to fill those spots. If you're interested in movie making and especially special effects history, then I'm sure many of those names are already quite familiar to you. But I hope I've been able to introduce some new names to you as well. So please do look into the work of those people, and maybe they'll inspire you as well.